Clerk for a Senate message.
Mr. Speaker, the Senate concurs with the House in the passage of the following entitled bill with amendment, the passage of which amendment the Senate asks the concurrence of the House. House Bill 1264, extending the Commission on the Seacoast Cancer Cluster investigation, setting the maximum contaminant level for certain perfluorochemicals in drinking water, establishing a per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances fund and programs and making an appropriation therefore, requiring insurance coverage for PFAS and PFC blood tests, and expanding the statute governing ambient groundwater quality standards. Representative Campion moves we concur. We have Spillane.
Okay. The question before the House is on the motion to concur with the Senate on the passage of HB 1264. The chair recognizes the member from Deerfield, Representative Spillane, to speak in opposition to the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to concurring with HB 1264. This is a bad bill for New Hampshire, and it will create undue burden to local taxpayers for no gain at all in public safety over the current standards. Don't take my word for it. My position of opposition to this bill is also backed by the Granite State Rural Water Association, the New Hampshire Municipal Association, the Northeast Biosolids and Residuals Association, the New Hampshire Water Works Association, and the New Hampshire Water Pollution Control Association, all of whom have contacted me and asked me to speak today. We are not often all on the same side of an opinion, but this bill is so terrible it has brought us all together. NHDES has estimated that the cost of implementation of these new PFAS standards will be on the order of $267 million, almost all to be borne by ratepayers at the local level. The $50 million worth of funding that is proposed in HB 1264 is for loans to municipalities and utilities and is less than 1/5 of the amount that is needed. These loans will create a burden at the local level, and although they will supposedly be forgiven if the state receives a settlement from PFAS manufacturers, there is no settlement in sight, and any such settlement at this time is doubtful within the next decade. Lastly, the process by which this bill comes to us in the House not only violates our House rules and history, it violates Part 1, Article 8 of our New Hampshire Constitution by denying the public due process and input on the many non-germane amendments attached by the other body. Specifically, it flagrantly violates our own Rule 110, which holds us to the provisions of RSA 91A. I strongly object to the process, which disregards our rules, statutes, and our Constitution. And I ask for a roll call.
The question before the House is on the motion that the House should concur with the Senate on the passage of HB 1264. The chair recognizes the member from Hebron, Representative Suit. Oh, will the member from Deerfield yield to a question?
I will not.
The member does not yield. The chair recognizes the member from Hebron, Representative Suzanne Smith. The member did not yield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of Senate Bill 1264 as amended by the Senate. House Bill 1264 addresses per- and polyfluoroalkyl chemicals in New Hampshire's drinking water. People who live near Pease Trade Port or Coakley Landfill, who live in Kensington or Stratford, Merrimack or Litchfield, just know how important this legislation is. This bill moves the already regulated maximum contaminant levels for some per- and polyfluoroalkyl chemicals for drinking water only from administrative rules into statute. It passed unanimously in the other chamber. In 2018, the legislature mandated that DES do the research and set MCLs for these forever chemicals. They demanded that DES consider the health of infants, children, and pregnant mothers when doing so. The EPA, when setting their numbers, only addressed this for adults. The 2018 legislature appropriated funds to pay for a toxicologist to develop these MCLs. This toxicologist collaborated with peers around the country doing research and came up with these MCLs, which were passed through administrative rules in the last year. This bill sets up funding mechanisms to pay for any remediation that needs to be done, to help municipalities pay for it. And I do have a disagreement with my colleague who spoke before me. I'm looking at the New Hampshire Municipal Association's most recent legislative bulletin, calling this one of their major policy issues and urging us to concur. This bill also sets up funding mechanisms, which is why New Hampshire Municipal Association supports it. There's a drinking water protection program and a groundwater, surface water, and aquatic protection programs, which are low-interest loans. This bill also sets up a PFAS remediation loan fund, which will be established much like the successful Drinking and Groundwater Trust Fund, which was established with money from the Exxon MTBE settlement. This PFAS remediation loan fund will be funded from lawsuits which the state has already filed against the manufacturers of per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. This part of the bill was passed unanimously by the House on the consent calendar in March. What price do we want to put on the health of our people in our great state? The EPA, by only considering adults, left out a very valuable part of our population: children, infants, and pregnant mothers. Keep in mind that this bill only addresses the MCLs for drinking and groundwater. It does not affect surface waters and therefore does not have an effect on wastewater treatment plants unless their residuals end up in drinking water. So I ask you to support the concurrence on this bill, and thank you.
Will the member yield to a question? The member will not yield. Question before the House on the motion to concur with the Senate on the passage of HB 1264. The chair recognizes the member from Brookfield, Representative Marsh, to speak in opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to oppose the concurrence motion on House Bill 1264. I want to briefly call your attention to 3 sections of this bill. Section 3 sets drinking water standards for perfluorochemicals. The standards set are approximately 1/3 of the 70 parts per trillion of PFOAs and PFOSs, which the EPA set as a lifetime health advisory in 2016. According to the EPA, this health advisory level offers a margin of protection for all Americans through their life from adverse health effects resulting from exposure to PFOAs and PFOSs in their drinking water. DES already adopted these standards through rulemaking. We've heard that. And they are currently being challenged in the New Hampshire Supreme Court due to DES's failure to conduct an adequate cost-benefit analysis as required by law. Both the New Hampshire Municipal Association and the Business and Industry Association are supporting this court challenge. Pending court action would be sufficient reason to non-concur alone, but that is not the only flaw in this bill. Section 6 appropriates $50 million to be funded by issuing general issue bonds. The most recent comprehensive annual financial report posted on the state's website says we have $711 million in general long-term debt. Consequently, this one bill would increase our state's indebtedness by 7%. Given that our revenues are also declining, we can hardly afford the deterioration in our bond rating this bill would cause. Sections 10 through 14 mandate health insurance coverage for blood tests for PFOAs and PFOSs. This year, Health, Human Services, and Elderly Affairs heard House Bill 1456, which would have set up a blood testing program just for pregnant women. We heard testimony that these blood tests are not clinical tests. They are research tests. My good friend and fellow physician from Freedom wrote in House Calendar 10 that there is no defined acceptable level of PFAS in the blood. Additionally, since PFAS persist in the body, its presence in the blood is reflective of past experience, and one needs to focus on current exposure from water and other sources. What that means is that clinicians will have no way of interpreting the test. The doctors won't know what to tell the patients. Consequently, these sections will increase healthcare insurance costs without any clinical benefit. Mr. Speaker, we cannot afford the provisions the other body added to this bill, and therefore I urge you all to push the red button. Mr. Speaker, I do not yield to questions, and I ask for a roll call vote.
The question before the House on the motion to concur with the Senate on the passage of HB 1264. The chair recognizes our last speaker, the member from Hampton, Representative Cushing, to speak in support of the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 5 years ago, when news broke that New Hampshire had a pediatric cancer cluster, I think it shocked many of us. And what this bill does initially is it extends the Seacoast Cancer Cluster Commission that is trying to respond to the anguish and the fear that's on the part of many people who live around contaminated areas where there is also a high incidence of cancer. I want to applaud the Senate for improving what was already a pretty good bill that the House sent over. And I want to recognize that in the narrative of what's transpired since the emergence of environmentally triggered cancers is an awareness of the dangers of PFAS. And that manifested itself last year when the state of New Hampshire, and I applaud the governor and the attorney general, brought suit against the manufacturers who knowingly, over a period of 4 decades, had substances that were toxic, that were discharged in the environment and did damages to human beings. I thought it was wonderful that the state of New Hampshire hired Rob Bellot, who, as people may know who've seen the movie Dark Waters, was the pioneering litigator to hold the polluting chemical companies accountable. And in recognition of this, in anticipation that eventually we will hold the polluters accountable, but we needed to take steps right now to clean up the damage that's being done before it impacts our citizens anymore. The state in this House moved ahead earlier this year when we set up a bill that passed that would make sure that the proceeds from that lawsuit would actually be used to clean up and to mitigate the harm that was done by those polluters. That's what this House did and passed through the Resources and Recreation Development Committee. The Senate recognized that the need to have some additional funding to get things going quick in anticipating that we will get paid back. And again, I want to commend the minority leader of this House for joining in with the Senate amendment that established this, this fund that would be funded, that would have from it in advance the proceeds of a bonding sale that would then be used to help municipalities clean up their drinking water. That's right, we're talking about cleaning up drinking water. And I think that we need to realize that we can't wait any longer. There's nothing more precious than having the ability to drink clean water. The amendments to the Senate bill are sound. I know that the Senate decided to pass it, I believe it was 23-1, and I'm glad that the governor has signaled his intent to sign the bill. So I would urge my colleagues from both sides of the aisle to say that we agree on one thing: everyone should have clean drinking water, and to vote to concur with House Bill 1264.
Question before the House is on the motion to concur with the Senate on the passage of HB 1264. Representative Blaine has requested a roll call vote to inquiry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if I know that this bill creates a $50 million bond in the fiscal year 2021 year, and that represents 40% of all possible bonding for that year. And Mr. Speaker, if I know that next year's finances are unknown, that even now, as we said on the Ways and Means Committee, we adjust those numbers on a regular basis. Mr. Speaker, if I know that $50 million is just a drop in the bucket for this actual cost to both municipalities and local water districts, and that those municipalities and water districts would have to carry the balance, which is well in excess of over $250 million as estimated by the Department of Environmental Services. And the vast majority of that fund would have to be borne by our local property taxpayers in those municipalities. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, if I know that this is not the time to be using our bonding when we're into such financial times and we're not sure what's going to happen with state revenues, would I now vote no and allow this to come back next year after we have some better understanding what finances will look like?
The question before the House is on the motion to concur with the Senate on the passage of HB 1264. The chair recognizes Representative Cushing for a parliamentary inquiry.
Mr. Speaker, if I know that the Municipal Association supports this legislation, and if I know that human life has a value that I don't want to equate with a bonding capacity, but I know that there is an urgency to protect our drinking water, to protect our families, would I now vote yes in support of House Bill 1264?
This will be a roll call vote. The question before the House is on the motion to concur with the Senate in the passage of HB 1264. If you're in favor, you'll press the green or the A button. If you're opposed, you'll press the red or the E button. Voting stations will be open for 30 seconds. Have all members present had an opportunity to vote? The House will be attentive to the state of the vote. With 210 members voting yea, 116 voting nay, the motion to concur passes. The chair is recognized for a message
Mr.
to the
Speaker?
House. Yes.
I move that the remarks from the previous debate be printed in the journal.
Without objection, so ordered. Recognize the clerk.